Robin had just pulled into his driveway after a long, exhausting day at work. His body ached from sitting in traffic for nearly an hour, and all he wanted was to get inside, kick off his shoes, and enjoy a quiet evening. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Everything seemed peaceful until he noticed her. Across the street, standing on her porch with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, was his neighbor, Karen Whitmore. Robin had seen her before, though they had never spoken much. She was one of those neighbors who always seemed to be watching, always had an opinion about everyone else's business. He had caught her staring a few times before, but tonight there was something different about the way she looked at him. It wasn't just curiosity, it was suspicion. Robin sighed, shaking his head as he turned off the engine. He reached for his briefcase in the passenger seat, but before he could even step out of the car, he saw Karen lift her phone to her ear. Her voice, though slightly muffled, carried across the quiet suburban street. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious man in my neighborhood," she said, her tone sharp and urgent. "He's just sitting in a car that doesn't belong to him, and he won't leave." Robin closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply to calm himself. He knew exactly what was happening. He had read about situations like this, seen videos online, heard the horror stories from friends and family. It was always the same, a black man simply existing in a space someone else decided he didn't belong in. Taking another breath, he stepped out of the car, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want any misunderstandings, even though he had every right to be there. His own driveway, his own home. And yet to Karen, he was an intruder. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" Karen flinched slightly, but she held her ground, still clutching her phone. "I don't know who you are, but this is private property," she snapped. "You need to leave before the police get here." Robin let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "This is private property. My property." He gestured toward the house. "I live here. I've lived here for 2 years." Karen narrowed her eyes. "That's impossible. I know the people who live here. A nice couple, very respectful. You." She stopped, eyeing him up and down. "You don't belong here." Robin clenched his jaw. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he refused to give her the reaction she wanted. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said evenly, "but I do suggest you hang up before you embarrass yourself." She didn't. Instead, she continued speaking into the phone. "Yes, he's getting aggressive now," she told the dispatcher. "He's threatening me." Robin's stomach twisted. He knew how dangerous this could get. The wrong assumption, the wrong word, and this could turn into something much worse. He needed to de-escalate, but before he could say anything else, he heard the distant wail of sirens. The police were already on their way. Robin stood still, his heartbeat drumming in his ears as the sound of sirens grew closer. He had done nothing wrong, yet he found himself bracing for what was coming. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but out of frustration, out of fear. He had seen situations like this spiral out of control, and he knew that one wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, could turn his peaceful evening into a nightmare. Karen remained on her porch, her expression smug, as if she had just done her civic duty. She watched him with the confidence of someone who believed they were right, someone who had no doubt the police would see things her way. Robin could see it in her eyes. She thought she was protecting the neighborhood from him, from someone who didn't belong. Within moments, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing. The sight of them made Robin's stomach churn. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters, their expressions unreadable. They approached him cautiously, like he was some kind of threat. "You mind telling us what's going on here?" one officer asked, his voice firm but neutral. His badge read, "Officer Reynolds." Robin kept his hands visible and took a steadying breath. "There's nothing going on," he said, his voice calm but laced with irritation. "I just got home. This is my driveway. That's my house." He gestured toward the front door, but he kept his movements slow. Before either officer could respond, Karen stepped forward. "That's not true," she insisted. "He's lying. The people who live here are a nice older couple. He's trespassing." Robin exhaled sharply through his nose. "That nice couple you're talking about? They sold me this house 2 years ago," he said, his patience wearing thin. You'd know that if you ever bothered to speak to your neighbors instead of spying on them. Karen scoffed. I do know my neighbors, and I know you don't belong here. Robin shook his head, turning his attention back to the officers. I have my ID inside, he said. And if you need proof, I have mail with my name on it, utility bills, whatever you need. Officer Reynolds exchanged a glance with his partner before nodding. All right, let's verify that. Karen's face twisted in frustration. You're just going to believe him? She snapped. Reynolds shot her a look. Ma'am, if he can prove residency, then there's no issue here. Robin walked toward his front door, aware of how closely the officers were watching his every move. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and grabbed the nearest piece of mail with his name and address on it. When he returned, he handed it to Reynolds, who examined it before nodding in confirmation. Looks like he's telling the truth, Reynolds said, handing a letter back. Sir, sorry for the inconvenience. Karen's mouth fell open. You're just going to let him go? She sputtered. How do you know it's not fake? Robin let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. But before he could say anything else, Reynolds' partner asked, Sir, would you like to press charges for a false report? Robin was caught off guard by the officer's question. Press charges? He hadn't even considered it. His mind had been so focused on making sure the situation didn't escalate that the idea of holding Karen accountable hadn't crossed his mind. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since this ordeal started, she seemed nervous. Her arms were still crossed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Maybe she hadn't expected the police to give him a chance to defend himself. Maybe she thought they'd just arrest him without question. Robin let out a slow breath. I don't know, he admitted, looking at the officers. What would that even mean? Officer Reynolds' partner, a woman whose name tag read Officer Daniels, stepped forward. Filing a false police report is a serious offense, she explained, especially when it's racially motivated. You were accused of trespassing on your own property, and if we hadn't verified your residency, things could have gone very differently for you tonight. Robin swallowed hard. He knew exactly what she meant. A different set of officers, a different reaction, and he could have ended up in handcuffs, or worse. Karen scoffed. Oh, come on, she snapped. I wasn't lying. I thought he was trespassing. That's not a crime. Daniels turned to her. Actually, ma'am, it is a crime to call 911 on someone based on an assumption, especially when that assumption is rooted in discrimination. Karen's face turned red. This is ridiculous. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Robin let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Protect it from what, Karen? Me? The guy who's lived here for 2 years? She flinched at the way he said her name, but she didn't respond. Daniels looked back at Robin. It's up to you. If you want to press charges, we can move forward with that. If not, we can just document the incident and leave it at that. Robin hesitated. A part of him wanted to press charges. He wanted her to feel some kind of consequence for what she had done, for the stress, the fear, the humiliation. But another part of him just wanted to be done with it. He didn't want to drag this out, didn't want to deal with the hassle of legal proceedings. He let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temple. Just document it, he finally said. I don't want to deal with a court case. I just want to go inside and enjoy my damn evening. Reynolds nodded. Fair enough. We'll file a report, and if something like this happens again, there'll be a record of it. Karen looked smug again, as if she had won. Robin, however, wasn't letting her off the hook that easily. He turned to her, his voice firm. Next time before you pick up that phone, maybe think before you assume the worst about someone just because they don't look like you. She didn't respond, just huffed and turned toward her house. As the officers walked back to their patrol cars, Robin exhaled, exhaustion settling over him. He had lived in this neighborhood for 2 years. He had always wanted to believe things like this wouldn't happen to him. Clearly, he had been wrong. The police had left, the flashing lights no longer reflecting off the houses, but Robin still stood in his driveway, hands on his hips, trying to shake the feeling in his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was frustration, exhaustion, something deeper that he couldn't quite put into words. He turned toward his house, but just as he reached for the door handle, he heard Karen's voice behind him. You know, she called out, her tone laced with irritation. You didn't have to make such a big deal out of it. Robin froze. His jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath before turning around. A big deal? He repeated, his voice low and controlled. Karen shrugged, arms crossed again like she was defending herself. I was just looking out for the neighborhood. If you weren't so defensive, this wouldn't have turned into an issue. Robin let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Karen, you called the police on me for parking in my own driveway. Do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been for me? She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. The police weren't going to do anything to you. If you weren't acting suspicious, none of this would have happened. Robin took a step closer, his patience running dangerously thin. Acting suspicious? He gestured to himself. You mean coming home from work, parking my car, stepping out of it? That's suspicious to you. Karen's lips pressed together, but she didn't back down. I didn't recognize you, okay? You're not exactly the type of person who... She stopped herself, but it was too late. Robin narrowed his eyes. The type of person who what, Karen? She looked away, suddenly very interested in the ground. Forget it, she muttered. I didn't mean anything by it. Robin exhaled sharply. That's the problem, he said, his voice calmer but no less firm. You never mean anything by it. You didn't mean anything when you assumed I was a criminal. You didn't mean anything when you told the police I was a threat. You didn't mean anything when you refused to believe I lived here. But the fact that you keep saying you didn't mean anything doesn't change the fact that you did something. Karen shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, she actually looked unsure of herself. But Robin didn't wait for her to respond. He had wasted enough of his time on her already. You can try to justify it all you want, he continued. But deep down, you know why you called the cops on me. And until you're willing to admit that to yourself, nothing's going to change. He turned away, ready to finally put this night behind him. But before he stepped inside, he glanced back one last time. Karen still stood there, arms crossed, but her expression was different now. She looked smaller somehow. Robin didn't know if anything he said would ever really get through to her. Maybe she'd just brush it off and keep living in her bubble. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd start to question the things she thought she knew. The next morning, Robin stepped onto his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was crisp, the sun peeking over the rooftops, casting soft golden light on the quiet suburban street. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful morning. But as he glanced across the road, his eyes landed on Karen, standing in her yard, watering her flowers as if nothing had happened the night before. Robin shook his head. He wasn't expecting an apology. Not from her. People like Karen rarely admitted they were wrong. They moved on, convinced they had done nothing wrong, that their actions were justified, that their concern was just them being good neighbors. He had seen it before. He took a sip of his coffee, trying to let it go, but his mind kept circling back to the same thought. What if things had gone differently? What if the police officers had been more aggressive? What if they hadn't believed him? He could have been handcuffed on his own front lawn, humiliated in front of his neighbors. He could have been arrested, or worse. And for what? Because Karen refused to believe he belonged here? As if she could feel his gaze, Karen looked up and met his eyes. For a brief second, she hesitated. Then, surprisingly, she put down the watering can and started walking toward him. Robin raised an eyebrow but didn't move. He had no idea what she could possibly have to say, but he wasn't going to be the one to run from this conversation. When she reached the edge of his driveway, she stuffed her hands into the pockets of her cardigan. Hey, she said awkwardly. Robin just stared at her. Hey, she rocked on her heels, glancing around before looking back at him. Listen, about last night, she hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. I might have overreacted. Robin let out a dry chuckle. Overreacted? He repeated. Karen, you called the cops on me. She flinched but nodded. Yeah, I know. I honestly didn't think you lived here. I really thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? Robin shook his head in disbelief. The right thing would have been asking before assuming I was some kind of criminal. Karen sighed, rubbing her forehead. I guess I've just always been a little protective of the neighborhood. Robin gave her a long, measured look. No, Karen, you've always been protective of what you think the neighborhood should look like. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking down. For the first time, she didn't have a snappy response, no excuse to justify herself. Robin sighed. Look, I don't expect you to change overnight, but if you really care about this neighborhood, maybe start by actually knowing your neighbors, not just the ones who look like you. Karen nodded slowly. Yeah, I'll try. Robin wasn't sure if he believed her, but as she turned and walked back to her house, he realized something. Whether she truly learned from this or not, he had made himself clear. And that, at least, was something.